flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls as Thomas Brennan jolted awake from another nightmare. Sweat beaded on his weathered brow, his hand instinctively reaching for the Colt 45 that never left his side. But something was different tonight, something that made his blood run cold. There, standing in the amber glow of his dying fire, was a silhouette that didn't belong. A woman's figure, graceful yet deadly still, watching him with eyes that seemed to pierce straight through his soul. Eyes he recognized from a nightmare that had haunted him for 14 long years. "You remember me, don't you, Thomas Brennan?" Her voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk, soft yet sharp enough to draw blood. His throat went dry. Those eyes. God help him. Those were the same terrified eyes of a 7-year-old Apache girl he'd pulled from the carnage at Apache Canyon in 1871. But now, they belonged to a woman, a dangerous, beautiful woman who'd somehow found him in the middle of nowhere. What did she want? And more importantly, what would she do to the man who destroyed her world? Stay with me as we uncover a tale of guilt, redemption, and a love that blooms in the darkest corners of the American frontier. Do you think saving me will wash away the blood on your hands? The Apache words rolled off her tongue like honey laced with poison, but it was her English that cut deepest. Thomas lowered his weapon, the metal suddenly feeling impossibly heavy in his calloused hands. Luna Redhawk. That's what the Mission Sisters had named her, after he'd delivered a traumatized child to their doorstep all those years ago. But standing before him now, she was no longer that broken little girl. She was a force of nature, wrapped in soft buckskin and feminine curves that made his chest tight with something far more dangerous than fear. 14 years, she continued, circling him like a predator. 14 years I've been searching for the soldier who saved me from the massacre he helped create. Thomas's jaw clenched. Apache Canyon. The name alone was enough to send him reaching for the bottle, but tonight there would be no whiskey to drown the memories. Tonight, his past had walked through his door wearing the face of an angel and the heart of a warrior. "You want an apology?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. "I got plenty of those. Been practicing them every night for 14 years. She moved closer, close enough that he could smell the sage in her hair, see the way her chest rose and fell beneath the fitted bodice of her dress, a strange hybrid of Apache tradition and mission propriety that somehow made her even more striking. "I don't want your apologies, Thomas Brennan." Her finger traced along his stubbled jawline, a touch so light it might have been imagined, yet it burned like a brand. "I want to understand why a soldier who killed my family would risk his life to save one Apache child." The question hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Outside, the Arizona wind howled through the canyon, carrying with it the ghosts of choices that could never be undone. Thomas had spent 14 years as a rancher, driving cattle and building fences, trying to construct a life solid enough to wall out the screams that echoed in his dreams. But Luna Redhawk had just torn down every wall he'd built with nothing more than those dark, knowing eyes, and a voice that promised either salvation or damnation. Maybe both. The silence stretched between them like a taut bowstring, ready to snap. Thomas studied her face in the firelight, the high cheekbones that spoke of noble Apache blood, the full lips that had learned to form English words in a mission school, the way her skin glowed golden in the amber light. "You grew up beautiful," he said quietly, immediately regretting the words. Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or anger. "Did you expect the frightened child you saved to remain broken forever?" She moved to his fireplace, her movements fluid as water, deliberately graceful. The firelight caught the curves of her body through the thin fabric of her dress, and Thomas forced himself to look away. This was the girl he'd rescued. The thought should have felt like ice water, but instead, it only made the heat in his chest burn hotter. The Mission Sisters tried to beat the Apache out of me, Luna continued, her voice carrying a bitter edge. They braided my hair, like a white girl, forced me into their prayers, made me ashamed of my mother's songs. But every night, in the darkness of that cold dormitory, I remembered. I remembered your face, the face of the man who pulled me from hell. She turned to face him, and the intensity in her gaze made him take a step back. I learned to read, to write, to speak your language better than you do. And I used every skill they gave me to track you down. Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. 3 years it took me to find Thomas Brennan, formerly of the 7th Cavalry, now a cattle rancher, hiding in the Arizona Territory like a coward. I ain't hiding. The words came out defensive, weak. No? She stepped closer again, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Then why do you live like a hermit? Why do you drink yourself into unconsciousness every night? Why do you flinch every time the wind sounds like Apache war cries? Her hand pressed against his chest, right over his heart, and he wondered if she could feel how it hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. You saved me once, Thomas Brennan. Now I want to know if the man who showed mercy to a child has any mercy left for himself. Before he could answer, the sharp crack of a rifle shot split the night air. Luna's eyes went wide as the cabin window exploded in a shower of glass and splintered wood. Get down! Thomas grabbed her, pulling her against his chest as more shots peppered the cabin walls. They weren't alone anymore. How many? Luna whispered against his ear, her breath warm on his neck as they crouched behind his overturned table. Thomas peered through the shattered window. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like deadly fireflies. 4, maybe 5. Cattle rustlers, most likely. They probably figured an old hermit would be easy pickings. Another volley of shots splintered the wood above their heads. Thomas grabbed his Winchester from the gun rack, checking the chamber with practiced efficiency. Stay low, he commanded, but when he looked back, Luna was gone. Panic shot through him like lightning. Luna! She emerged from the shadows near his bedroom, and Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Gone was the mission-educated woman in her modest dress. In her place stood a vision from his deepest fantasies and his worst nightmares. Luna had stripped down to a buckskin vest that barely contained her full breasts, her long legs bare beneath a short Apache skirt that moved like liquid silk with each step. War paint streaked her cheekbones, and in her hand gleamed a bone-handled knife that looked older than the territory itself. Jesus Christ, he breathed. Your God isn't here tonight, she said, her voice carrying a deadly purr. But my ancestors are. A rustler kicked in the back door, just as Thomas spun to face the front window. The man raised his pistol, but Luna moved like smoke and shadow. Her knife found the gap between his ribs before he could squeeze the trigger, and he dropped without a sound. Behind you, Luna shouted. Thomas spun, firing through the front window. His shot caught one of the rustler's center mass, sending the man spinning into the dust. But there were still more out there, and they were getting bolder. We can't stay here, Thomas said, reloading quickly. They'll burn us out. Luna wiped her blade clean on the dead rustler's shirt, her movements casual, almost sensual. Then we go to them. We? She looked at him with those dark eyes, and Thomas saw something there that made his pulse quicken. Not fear, not anger, but anticipation. The thrill of the hunt. 14 years ago, you saved my life, she said, checking the rustler's gun belt. Tonight, I save yours. That makes us even. Luna, you don't understand. She silenced him with a kiss that tasted like gunpowder and wild honey, fierce and desperate and absolutely devastating. When she pulled away, Thomas felt like he'd been struck by lightning. I understand perfectly, she whispered against his lips. I understand that you're the only man who's ever looked at me and seen something worth saving. And I understand that I'd rather die fighting beside you than live without knowing what we could be. Outside, the rustlers were regrouping. Thomas could hear them calling to each other, planning their final assault. He had maybe 2 minutes before they rushed the cabin. 2 minutes to decide if he was going to die as the coward he'd become, or live as the man Luna Redhawk seemed to think he could be. The remaining rustlers made their move just after midnight, rushing the cabin from 3 sides, like wolves closing on wounded prey. But they hadn't counted on Luna. She moved through the darkness like her Apache ancestors, appearing behind the first man as he tried to circle around the cabin. Thomas watched from the window as she wrapped her arm around the rustler's throat, her knife sliding between his ribs with surgical precision. The man dropped without a cry, and Luna melted back into the shadows. 2 left, Thomas muttered, tracking movement through the darkness with his rifle sight. The remaining rustlers had gone quiet, realizing their numbers had been cut in half. Thomas could feel them out there, waiting, planning. The smart thing would be to wait them out, let them make the first move. But smart had never been his strong suit. He slipped out the back door, moving low and fast toward the old barn. Luna appeared beside him like a ghost, her skin gleaming with sweat and war paint in the moonlight. "The big one's in the rocks," she whispered, her lips brushing his ear. "The other one's trying to work around to the horses." Thomas nodded, but his concentration was shot to hell. Luna's hand rested on his arm, her fingers tracing patterns on his skin that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the fire building between them. "After this is over," he said quietly, "we need to talk." "Talk?" Her laugh was low and dangerous. "Thomas Brennan, if you survive the next 10 minutes, talking is the last thing I want to do with you." The promise in her voice nearly undid him, but before he could respond, muzzle flash lit up the rocks 50 yards away. Thomas dropped flat, pulling Luna down with him, feeling the solid warmth of her body pressed against his. "Stay here," he commanded. "Like hell." She was already moving, low and fast toward the gunman's position. Thomas cursed and followed, using the barn as cover. The rustler was good, professional, maybe even military, but he was thinking like a white man, expecting his enemies to behave like civilized folks. Luna didn't fight fair. She came at him from above, dropping from the barn roof like a hunting cat. Her knife found his gun hand first, then his throat. It was over in seconds. The last rustler broke cover, running for the horses with Thomas in pursuit. The man spun at the last second, pistol raised, but Thomas was faster. His colt barked once, and the rustler crumpled. Silence settled over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Thomas stood in the moonlight, gun still drawn, waiting for his heart to stop pounding. Then Luna was there, walking toward him with that same fluid grace. But now there was something different in her eyes, something that made his mouth go dry. "It's over," she said, but she was looking at him like the real fight was just beginning. Thomas holstered his weapon with hands that weren't quite steady. "Luna." She pressed her finger to his lips, stopping the words before they could form. "You fought beside me tonight. You trusted me with your life. You saved my life. And you saved mine. Again." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the pulse beating in her throat, feel the heat radiating from her skin. "Do you know what that means to an Apache woman, Thomas Brennan?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice. "It means you belong to me now," she whispered, "and I belong to you." Her hands found the buttons of his shirt, and Thomas realized that the most dangerous part of his night was just beginning. The cabin door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed to seal them away from the rest of the world. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the rough wooden walls, but Thomas barely noticed. His attention was completely consumed by the woman standing before him. Luna's war paint was smeared, her buckskin vest torn at the shoulder where a bullet had come too close. She looked wild, primitive, absolutely magnificent, and she was looking at him like he was the only man who had ever mattered. "Your shoulder," he said roughly, noticing the thin line of blood where the fabric had torn. "It's nothing." But she winced as she tried to remove the vest. Thomas moved without thinking, his hands gentle as he helped her slip the garment over her head. Her skin was like warm silk beneath his palms, and when she looked up at him with those dark eyes, he felt something inside him break open, something that had been locked away for 14 years. "I dreamed about you," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "Even before I knew what you'd become, I dreamed about those eyes." Luna's hands found his chest, her fingers tracing the scars that mapped his history like a battle-worn atlas. "I dreamed about you too, the man who chose mercy over orders, the soldier who carried a child to safety instead of leaving her to die." Her touch was driving him slowly insane, but Thomas forced himself to think clearly. "Luna, you need to understand. What happened that day? What my unit did? You think I don't know?" Her voice was fierce, proud. "You think I don't know that Thomas Brennan was following orders when the 7th Cavalry rode into Apache Canyon? You think I don't know that you disobeyed those same orders when you found me hiding in the rocks?" She pressed closer, her bare breasts soft against his chest, her lips inches from his. "I know exactly who you are, Thomas Brennan. You're the man who's been punishing himself for 14 years for someone else's war. You're the man who chose to save rather than destroy, even when it cost you everything." "It didn't cost me everything," he said, his hands sliding down to her waist, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him. "It brought me you." When she kissed him this time, it wasn't desperate or fierce, like before. It was slow, thorough, a claiming that went soul deep. Thomas felt the last of his resistance crumble as her tongue traced his lower lip, as her hands tangled in his hair and pulled him down to meet her. They moved together toward his bed, like dancers following music only they could hear. Luna's skirt fell away, like water, and Thomas had to stop breathing at the sight of her. Proud, beautiful, offering herself to him with a trust that humbled him. "Are you sure?" he asked, even as his hands mapped the curves of her body with reverent touches. "I've never been more sure of anything." She drew him down to her, her legs wrapping around his waist, her back arching as he kissed the hollow of her throat. "Love me, Thomas. Help me forget everything but this moment." Their joining was slow, intense, a healing that went deeper than flesh. Thomas lost himself in the warmth of her body. The soft sounds she made when he touched her just right, the way she whispered his name like a prayer against his skin. Afterward, they lay entwined in the flickering firelight, her head on his chest, his fingers combing through her long black hair. For the first time in 14 years, Thomas Brennan felt at peace. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Luna was quiet for so long, he thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she raised her head, and he saw something in her eyes that made his chest tight. "Now?" She traced a pattern over his heart with one finger. "Now you let me love you, the way you deserve to be loved. and you stop running from the good man I know you are." But even as she spoke, Thomas caught something in her voice, a hesitation, a sadness that suggested morning might bring choices neither of them wanted to make. Thomas woke to silence. The fire had died to glowing embers, and pale morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. He reached for Luna automatically, his body already missing her warmth, but his hand found only cold sheets and the faint impression where she had lain. "Luna?" He sat up, scanning the dim cabin. Her buckskin clothing was gone from the floor where they'd discarded it. His heart started to pound with a fear that had nothing to do with rustlers or gunfights. That's when he saw it, a piece of paper on the rough wooden table, weighted down by her bone-handled knife. The knife that had saved his life. The knife she was leaving behind. Thomas's hands shook as he unfolded the note. Her handwriting was careful, precise, the product of mission education tempered by Apache pride. "Thomas, thank you for saving me twice. Once when I was a child who needed rescuing, and once last night when I needed to remember that not all men are enemies. You showed me that mercy exists in this world, and that love can bloom even in the shadow of great wrongs. I forgive you for Apache Canyon. More than that, I honor you for the choice you made when you found me in those rocks. You could have left me to die with my family, but you chose compassion over convenience. That choice made you the man I fell in love with last night. But we both know I cannot stay. The world sees us as enemies, Apache and cavalry, savage and civilized, past and future. My people would call me a traitor. Your people would call me a whore. We would destroy each other trying to bridge a gap too wide for love alone to cross. This is my gift to you. Walk away from the guilt you carry. You have been forgiven by the one person whose forgiveness matters. Live the life you deserve, free from the ghosts that have haunted you. And remember that somewhere in this vast territory, an Apache woman carries your heart with her, always." Luna Thomas read the letter twice, then sat heavily in his chair, the paper falling from numb fingers. Outside, he could hear the wind picking up, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. She was right, of course. She was always right. But knowing something and accepting it were two different things entirely. 3 months later, Thomas Brennan stood on a ridge overlooking the vast Arizona landscape, watching a dust cloud move across the valley below. Apache riders, maybe, or just wild horses running before a storm. He couldn't tell from this distance, and maybe that was better. The knife Luna had left behind hung at his belt now, its bone handle worn smooth by her touch. Some nights, when the whiskey couldn't quiet the loneliness, he'd hold it and remember the weight of her in his arms, the sound of her voice speaking his name like a blessing. The nightmares had stopped. Not because he'd forgotten Apache Canyon, but because Luna's forgiveness had finally given him permission to forgive himself. He still raised cattle, still lived alone in his cabin, but he no longer felt like a man waiting to die. He'd heard rumors in town, talk of an Apache woman who worked as a translator for the territorial government, helping negotiate treaties between the tribes and Washington. A woman with fierce dark eyes and a reputation for fairness. The rumors never mentioned her name, but Thomas knew. Luna Redhawk was building bridges between two worlds, just as she'd built a bridge across the chasm of his guilt. And maybe, in some small way, their one night together had given her the strength to trust that some white men could be decent. It wasn't the ending he'd dreamed of, but it was the ending they both deserved. If this story stirred something in your soul, if it made you believe in redemption and second chances, show some love with a like and subscribe for more tales from the frontier. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. I love connecting with fellow travelers on this journey through the untamed heart of human nature. Until next time, remember that even in the darkest canyons, love can find a way to bloom.